For years, Officer Gregory Calloway and Officer Anthony Miller did whatever they wanted. Every traffic stop was a trap. Every complaint disappeared. They ruled through fear, knowing no one could touch them, until they harassed the wrong man. A black man walking his German shepherd through a quiet neighborhood. A man they assumed was powerless, just another face they could intimidate. When he didn't submit, when he questioned their authority, they escalated. Harsh words became threats. Threats became violence. And when his dog stepped forward, one of them reached for his gun. Now, Malcolm Hayes, a Delta Force operative with nothing left to lose, is coming for them. The officers thought they understood power, thought their badges made them untouchable, but they have no idea what's coming. Justice will be swift and painful. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban street, its golden light filtering through the trees that lined the neatly paved sidewalks. Rex's paws tapped rhythmically against the concrete, his ears flicking at the distant hum of a lawnmower, the occasional chirp of birds hidden among the branches. His leash hung loosely in Malcolm's grip, the German shepherd moving in perfect sync with his owner, alert but relaxed. It was a beautiful day, one of those rare moments when the world felt still, uncomplicated. Malcolm took a slow breath, inhaling the crisp scent of freshly cut grass, feeling the weight of the day ease just slightly. This walk was part of his routine, a simple pleasure after long weeks spent traveling for work. He had been away longer than usual this time, overseeing security operations overseas. Now that he was back, he wanted nothing more than to enjoy the little things. A quiet walk with Rex, the feeling of the sun on his skin, the comfort of home. Yet, even as he savored the moment, he was aware of the eyes. It always happened. A car rolling to a slow stop at a nearby intersection, the slight movement of a curtain in a second-story window. A jogger who hesitated just a little too long before continuing past. Malcolm had spent most of his adult life in high-risk environments, where survival depended on reading a situation before it unfolded. Out there, it was about identifying threats, enemy combatants, hidden explosives, unseen dangers waiting in the shadows. Here, in the place that was supposed to be home, it was different, subtler, less overt, but no less real. He felt it in the way strangers' eyes lingered on him just a second too long, in the way some clutched their purses a little tighter, in the way a man walking his golden retriever had crossed the street last week without ever making eye contact. He had done nothing but exist. And still, it was enough to make people uneasy. It was ironic, really. He had spent over a decade in the most elite counterterrorism unit in the world, the U.S. Army's Delta Force. He had operated in places where stepping into the wrong alley meant never stepping out again, where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had taken down warlords, dismantled terrorist cells, protected people who never even knew they were in danger. And yet, here, in his own neighborhood, the place he had paid for with blood, sweat, and sacrifice, he was the one who didn't belong. A car turned the corner ahead, creeping forward at a pace that felt too deliberate. Malcolm glanced toward it, already knowing what he was about to see. The black and white paint job, the familiar shape of the police cruiser, the low, humming growl in Rex's chest was so soft that no one else would have heard it. Malcolm gave the leash a small tug. "Easy, boy." His voice was calm, soothing. Rex obeyed instantly, his head tilting toward Malcolm as if reading his expression. The cruiser slowed as it pulled alongside him, matching his pace. Then came the voice. "Afternoon, sir." Malcolm stopped walking, turning toward the vehicle with measured ease. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral. No tension, no challenge. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, keeping his tone polite. Always polite. The driver, Officer Calloway, leaned against the open window, his expression unreadable, but his eyes assessing, cataloging, searching. His partner, Officer Miller, had already stepped out of the vehicle, his boots crunching against the pavement as he positioned himself just a few steps away. Close enough to intimidate, far enough to claim it wasn't intentional. They weren't here for a friendly chat. "You live around here?" Calloway asked, tilting his head slightly. His voice was casual, too casual. "Yes, sir," Malcolm answered without hesitation. Calloway's lips twitched, like he wasn't expecting the automatic respect. "That's so. Funny. Don't think I've seen you before." Malcolm offered a small, polite nod. "I travel a lot for work. Security contracting overseas. Just got back a few days ago." Miller scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. "Security contracting? That's some kind of fancy way of saying mercenary?" Malcolm let out a soft chuckle, as though he wasn't the least bit offended. "Let them think they had the upper hand." "Not quite," he said, keeping his voice friendly. "Private security for high-risk environments. I consult for agencies and corporations, help train teams for emergency response." Calloway nodded slowly, but there was something in his expression that didn't sit right. "Well," he said, shifting slightly, "we got a call about someone looking suspicious in the neighborhood. Figured we'd check it out." Malcolm raised a brow but kept his tone even. "I see. I wasn't aware walking my dog was suspicious." Calloway smirked. "You'd be surprised what people think is suspicious these days." Miller took a slow step closer, his eyes dropping to Rex, who was still standing calmly but watching the officers with quiet intensity. "That's a big dog," Miller commented, feigning interest. "Trained?" "Yes, sir." "Trained for what?" Malcolm let the question settle in the air for a moment, still maintaining his relaxed stance. He knew where this was going. Obedience. Protection. He's very disciplined. Miller nodded slowly, as if weighing the words. Then Calloway shifted the conversation. "Gonna need to see some ID." It wasn't a request. Malcolm knew his rights. He could ask why. He could refuse. He could stand his ground. But he also knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. "Of course," he said smoothly, already reaching into his jacket, moving slowly, deliberately. Rex let out a barely audible rumble, shifting slightly closer. Calloway's eyes flicked toward the dog, and Malcolm didn't miss the way his fingers twitched near his belt. "Whoa there," Miller muttered, his voice just a little sharper. "You might want to keep that thing under control." Malcolm's jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice remained level. "Rex is fine. He's well-trained." Calloway chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Something about the way he said it made Malcolm's stomach tighten. It was the tone, the unspoken promise of what was coming next. He pulled his wallet out carefully, holding it up. Calloway barely glanced at it before waving his hand dismissively. "Nah, I think we're going to need you to step over here for a second. Just a few questions." Malcolm exhaled slowly, carefully. "Don't give them an excuse." He gave Rex's leash the lightest tug, signaling the command to stand down. Then he stepped forward, and that was when everything changed. Malcolm stepped forward, moving with deliberate calm, his wallet held out for them to take. Rex's leash remained steady in his grip, his stance unchanged, but the dog's body had tensed just slightly, an imperceptible shift that only Malcolm would have noticed. He could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny, the way their eyes tracked his every movement, how Calloway's smirk barely masked the sharp edge of control he was trying to exert over the situation. Miller took the wallet with a lazy sort of arrogance, flipping it open like he expected to find something damning inside. His fingers traced over the identification card, his lips twisting slightly before he turned it toward Calloway. "Well, look at that," Miller mused, shaking his head. "We got ourselves a real-life soldier." Calloway took the wallet from him, glancing at it with an unimpressed expression. "Delta Force, huh?" His voice carried that same casual disdain, as if even Malcolm's service to the country wasn't enough to earn a shred of basic respect. "That's supposed to mean something?" Malcolm didn't react. He had learned long ago that men like this wanted a reaction, craved it, fed off it. Any sign of irritation or defiance would only give them an excuse to push harder. So he remained as he was, calm, polite, immovable. "It means I've served," he said, his tone even, measured, "and now I work in security consulting, as I mentioned earlier." Calloway let out a small chuckle, shaking his head before handing the wallet back to Malcolm in a way that forced him to step closer to take it. It was a small thing, but Malcolm recognized it for what it was, a power play. He took his wallet back, tucking it into his jacket without breaking eye contact. "That's so," Calloway drawled, "because what I see is a guy walking around a neighborhood where people don't seem to recognize him. And you know how it is. Folks around here get nervous when they see someone they don't think belongs." There it was. They weren't even bothering with subtlety anymore. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I do belong. I live here." "Yeah?" Calloway folded his arms, stepping just slightly closer. "Then you won't mind answering a few more questions, would you?" Malcolm remained where he was, neither retreating nor advancing. "I believe I already have." Miller scoffed under his breath, adjusting his belt. "I don't know, Calloway. Something about his attitude don't sit right with me. Guy seems a little tense, don't you think?" Calloway smirked. "Yeah, almost like he's got something to hide." Malcolm took in a slow breath, centering himself, resisting the natural urge to respond. He had been in more hostile situations than he could count, had faced warlords, insurgents, men with bombs strapped to their chests, enemies who wanted him dead and had every means to make it happen. And yet, in all those years, he had never felt quite this level of restraint tightening around him like a vice. Because here, in his own country, in the very place he had fought to protect, he wasn't seen as a man who had served, as a citizen with rights. He was a threat, a problem to be handled, and Rex knew it. The dog had been trained to read situations, to recognize tension, to detect when his handler was in danger. And right now, though Malcolm remained still, Rex could sense that something was wrong. His ears were up, his gaze locked on the officers, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert. Calloway noticed. "You got that thing under control?" he asked, motioning toward Rex with a tilt of his chin. Malcolm tightened his grip just slightly on the leash. "He's fine. He's trained." Miller narrowed his eyes. "Yeah? Trained for what?" Malcolm kept his expression neutral. "Protection. Security. He follows commands." Calloway let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "A dog like that? All trained up to attack? Dangerous thing to be walking around with, don't you think?" "He's not trained to attack," Malcolm corrected, his patience thinning despite himself. "He's trained to defend." "Yeah?" Calloway's smirk widened. "And what exactly does he think you need defending from, huh?" The words sat between them, heavy with meaning. Malcolm said nothing. Miller exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I don't know, Calloway. Guy's got a big dog. Won't answer questions. Seems real on edge." He took another step forward, this time intentionally closing the space between them. "I think maybe we need to go ahead and bring him in, just to be safe." Malcolm could feel Rex's tension spiking, the leash pulling just slightly as the German shepherd adjusted his stance, muscles coiled, prepared. He could sense what was happening, could feel the shift, the moment just before a situation spiraled out of control. "You don't need to do that," Malcolm said, his voice carefully measured. "I've cooperated. I've shown my ID. There's no cause to detain me." Miller gave an exaggerated shrug. "Maybe. But see, I just don't like the way this is going. And I think we need to make sure everything checks out." Calloway tilted his head. "I think we're going to need you to turn around. Put your hands behind your back. Just for our safety, you understand?" Malcolm's jaw clenched ever so slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I haven't done anything." "Yeah?" Calloway smiled, stepping closer. "Then you won't mind?" It was a test, a deliberate, calculated provocation. And then Miller reached out, a hand on Malcolm's wrist, firm, insistent. Rex's snarl cut through the air like a blade. Instantly, both officers' hands went to their weapons. Malcolm moved without thinking. A shift of his arm, a fluid motion, redirecting Miller's grip without force, stepping back even as he held Rex's leash firm, grounding the dog before he could move. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Malcolm said quickly, his voice calm but sharp with authority. "He's reacting to your aggression. Stand down!" But they weren't listening. Miller had already drawn his gun, his face twisted into something Malcolm had seen before, fear disguised as control. "Get that dog back!" Calloway barked, stepping away, his own hand hovering over his holster. Rex was still in place, but his entire body was taut, his instincts screaming, his eyes locked on the men who now posed a clear and present danger to his handler. Malcolm's pulse slowed, his training kicking in, every single variable flashing through his mind in an instant. This wasn't going to end well. Malcolm raised his hands slowly, palms facing outward, his voice even, firm, controlled. "Listen, officers. I live here. You saw my ID. My address is on it. There's no issue." Rex remained still, but Malcolm could feel the leash tightening in his grip, his dog sensing every inch of his unease, every shift in the atmosphere, every note of tension vibrating in the air. This wasn't just some routine stop. It had never been one. And now, with hands near holsters, with voices sharpening, with the slow, creeping dread rising in Malcolm's chest, it was clear that these men had already decided how this was going to go. Calloway's smirk had disappeared, replaced with something colder, more calculating. "Then control your damn dog." Malcolm exhaled slowly, keeping his hands raised, refusing to let the irritation break through, refusing to give them even an inch of what they wanted. "Rex is under control. He hasn't moved. He's on a leash. He's trained, and he hasn't attacked. The only reason he's reacting is because you—" "I don't give a damn what you think, boy," Miller snapped, his voice cutting through the space between them like the crack of a whip. "I said, control your damn dog." Malcolm's fingers twitched. Not out of anger. No, he had buried that emotion deep, locked it away in the part of him that had learned long ago that losing his temper in moments like these could be a death sentence. It was discipline, calculation, training that told him that right now, every movement, every breath, every single thing he did was a potential trigger for something he couldn't undo. "Officers, please, I am complying," Malcolm said carefully, lowering his voice just slightly, trying to take some of the heat out of the moment. "You saw my ID. You know I live here. My dog is restrained. I am not resisting. So tell me, what exactly do you need from me right now?" Calloway took a step closer, his hand still twitching near his holster, his expression twisting into something Malcolm recognized instantly. He wasn't just looking for compliance. He was looking for an excuse. "You think this is a game?" Calloway sneered, his voice rising now. "You think we give a damn what you think? I don't care who you are, where you live, or what you do. Right now, you're a threat. And that mutt of yours? A damn liability." Miller moved another inch forward, his boots grinding against the pavement. "You want to keep talking? Or you want to do what the hell you're told?" Rex let out a low, warning growl. Malcolm shifted his weight slightly, angling himself just enough to keep the officers in view, while also maintaining his control over Rex. "You're escalating this situation, officers. I am standing still. My dog is standing still. The only aggression here is coming from you. Stand down now!" Miller barked, his voice sharp, commanding, filled with something just a little too eager. Malcolm's heart pounded, not in fear, but in frustration, in the suffocating knowledge that there was nothing he could say, no amount of reason that would shift the path they had chosen for this moment. Calloway gestured aggressively at the ground. "Put that mutt down. Make him sit. Now!" Malcolm kept his movements slow, calculated. He turned his head just slightly, giving a quiet, controlled command. "Rex! Down!" Immediately, Rex lowered himself to the ground, his body stiff but obedient, his ears flicking back slightly, sensing the forced nature of the order. Miller scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, now you want to listen?" Calloway wasn't satisfied. His hand dropped lower toward his holster. "Leash! Shorten it. Make sure he can't move." Malcolm's jaw clenched, but he obeyed, gripping the leash closer, keeping Rex locked in place, his breathing steady, his focus unwavering. Calloway exchanged a glance with Miller. Something silent passed between them, something unspoken but heavy. An agreement, a decision. Miller exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking out tension. "We're done playing around. Turn around, hands behind your back." Malcolm stiffened. His voice dropped to something lower, quieter, but still controlled. "I've done nothing wrong." Calloway's smirk returned. "Yeah, and yet, here we are." Malcolm didn't move. He knew what would happen if he turned around. The moment he gave them his back, he'd be in cuffs, shoved against the pavement, and whatever excuse they wanted to use afterward would be built off the fact that he resisted, even though he hadn't. "Turn around!" Miller ordered again, taking a step forward. Rex let out a deep, rolling growl. Both officers' hands shot to their guns. "Control your damn dog!" Miller shouted. Malcolm's voice snapped, sharp and authoritative. "He is controlled." "Not good enough!" Calloway yelled back, his fingers tightening on his weapon. Malcolm felt the shift, the moment before the moment. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. The air seemed to still. The heat of the sun suddenly distant. The world shrinking to just this space, this street. These men who had never once intended to let him walk away from this moment with his dignity intact. Miller moved first. His hand jerked toward his gun. Rex reacted before Malcolm could even process the movement. A defensive instinct, a split-second reaction, the very thing the officers had been waiting for. A single bark, sharp, quick, a warning. Then the shift of muscle as Rex tensed. Malcolm barely had time to process the movement before it happened. The gunshot rang out, splitting through the air like a crack of thunder. The leash jerked in Malcolm's hand, and then Rex stumbled. The world slowed. The sound of blood roaring in Malcolm's ears drowned out everything else. The officers' shouts, the distant noise of a car engine, the voices of unseen neighbors who had been watching from the safety of their windows. All he saw was Rex's body jerking back, the shock in his dark brown eyes, the way his legs faltered beneath him as his body gave way. "No!" Malcolm's voice didn't even sound like his own. His knees hit the pavement before he even realized he had moved. Rex collapsed against him, his weight heavy, too heavy, and Malcolm's hands were suddenly slick with warmth, with life slipping away far too fast. A low, pained whimper escaped from Rex's throat, his breathing shallow, uneven. Miller still had his gun raised, his face a twisted mask of self-satisfaction and mock surprise. Calloway simply shook his head, exhaling through his nose. "Told you he was a liability." Malcolm barely heard them. Everything inside him went still. Malcolm barely registered the voices around him, barely processed the shift in movement, the shuffle of boots against pavement, the crackle of a distant radio transmission. His entire world had shrunk to the warm, crumpling weight in his arms, to the sharp, ragged breaths tearing through Rex's throat, to the way his dog, his companion, his brother in arms, his protector, was struggling against the inevitable, refusing to let go even as his body failed him. "Stay with me," Malcolm whispered, his voice raw, hoarse, breaking on the edges. His hands pressed desperately against the wound, warm blood seeping between his fingers, pooling onto the pavement, staining his clothes, his skin, the world around him turning red as his vision blurred with something hotter, darker, more consuming than anything he had ever felt before. "I got you, boy. Stay with me, please." Rex's eyes were still on him, still alert, still searching his face as if waiting for a command. waiting for direction, but there was no battlefield, no mission, no threat to eliminate. Just pain, just confusion, just the deep, unspoken bond between them unraveling too fast for Malcolm to stop it. He could feel the tremors racking through Rex's body, the rapid, panicked rise and fall of his chest, the small, strangled sounds escaping from his throat as if he wanted to respond, to tell Malcolm he was still fighting, that he would always fight. But the strength was fading, slipping like sand through Malcolm's grasp, like something he had no power to hold on to. "You're okay. You're okay," Malcolm muttered, his hands shaking as he stroked Rex's head, his fingers slipping over the damp fur, cradling his dog's face as if he could keep him grounded, keep him here. "You're strong, buddy. Just hold on. Damn it, Rex! Don't you quit on me." The officers were talking. He could hear them, but they didn't matter. Their voices were nothing but distant, meaningless noise, like the buzzing of insects, irrelevant and hollow against the sound of Rex's slowing breaths, against the pulse of rage rising in Malcolm's chest like a tidal wave, violent and uncontainable. Then Rex let out a final, shallow exhale, and his body went still. Something inside Malcolm snapped. He lifted his head, eyes burning, blood smeared across his hands, his forearms, his clothes. His breathing hitched, then turned to something deeper, rougher, jagged with fury. His entire body trembled, but it wasn't with grief. It was something else, something hotter, something breaking loose from the deepest part of him, something primal, something that had been chained down for too damn long. "You!" His voice was a growl, a threat, an unfiltered burst of hatred coiling around his words, barely contained, barely human. He surged upward, pushing away from Rex's still body, his hands clenching into fists, his entire stance shifting, rigid, braced, ready. "You killed him!" Miller flinched, but Calloway just sneered, shaking his head like he was dismissing a child's tantrum. "That's on you, big guy. Should have controlled your damn dog." The world turned red. Malcolm lunged, not thinking, not planning, just moving, just acting, just giving in to the raw, vicious, undeniable fury tearing through every inch of him. He wanted to feel his fists sink into flesh, wanted to break something, wanted to tear them apart the way they had just torn his world apart. The sharp, brutal snap of electricity slammed into his spine. His entire body seized, muscles locking, nerves igniting in blinding, unbearable pain as the taser's voltage ripped through him, stealing his breath, stealing his strength, sending him crashing back to the ground. His body convulsed, pain exploding through every nerve, his vision white-hot with agony, his jaw locking as the current overpowered every thought, every instinct, leaving him helpless, thrashing against the pavement, unable to move, unable to do anything but feel. And then they were on him, boots pressing against his arms, against his back, pistols leveled at his head, voices shouting, demanding, barking orders like he was some wild animal they needed to put down. "Stay down! Don't you move! Hands behind your back! Now!" Malcolm gasped, choking on his own breath, rage and grief crashing into his chest like a wrecking ball, every part of him screaming to fight back, to break free, to do something, anything but submit. But they had guns. They had already killed Rex. And if he moved again, if he gave them even the slightest excuse, they'd do the same to him. His body trembled, his muscles still twitching from the taser, but he forced his arms behind his back, his fists clenching so tightly, his nails dug into his own palms, hard enough to draw blood. The weight of a knee pressed between his shoulder blades, grinding him down, suffocating, humiliating. "Yeah, that's right," Calloway muttered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That's where you belong." Malcolm let out a raw, guttural scream, It wasn't a sound of pain. It was rage, pure and undiluted, thick with grief, with helplessness, with a fury so deep it felt like it would burn him alive. "You killed him!" he roared, his voice cracking, breaking, shattering under the weight of everything that was spiraling out of control. "You murdered him!" His voice was hoarse, but he kept yelling, kept screaming, as if he could force the world to listen, as if he could undo what had just been done through sheer force of will. But no one listened. Calloway yanked him up by his arms, the metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists, his grip rough, punishing. Miller holstered his weapon, watching with something between amusement and indifference, as Malcolm was dragged toward the squad car, his body still trembling with unspent rage, with grief too big to contain. He fought against it, against the hands shoving him forward, against the injustice burning like fire in his throat, against the unbearable reality that Rex was gone, that his best friend had just died in his arms, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. But the metal door slammed shut behind him, and he was trapped, alone. The sound of his own ragged, furious breathing was the only thing left. And then, slowly, something else settled in. Something colder, something sharper, something that felt like steel locking into place. They thought this was over. They thought they had won. But Malcolm wasn't just some man on a walk with his dog. He was in the Delta Force, and one way or another, he was going to burn their world to the ground. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Malcolm's wrists, biting deeper with every shift of the vehicle as it rumbled down the road, its sirens silent, its passengers indifferent to the man shackled in the back. His chest still heaved, his breath uneven, his pulse a war drum hammering against his ribs, his entire body a raw, frayed nerve that hadn't stopped vibrating since the moment that gunshot had shattered the world. His fingers twitched against the unforgiving metal, muscles still spasming from the lingering effects of the taser, the aftershocks of forced compliance still pulsing through his veins. His jaw ached from how tightly he had been clenching his teeth, his throat raw from the screams they had ignored, from the pure, undiluted rage that had poured from his soul and yet had done nothing to change the fact that Rex was gone. He could still feel the weight of him, still see those dark eyes filled with loyalty, filled with trust, looking at him in those final moments, waiting for a command, waiting for him to fix it, to protect him, to stop the inevitable from happening. He had never felt so powerless. The cruiser jerked to a stop. The doors swung open. Calloway's hand wrapped around his arm like he was dragging a corpse from a ditch, yanking him forward with a force that sent a jolt of pain shooting through his shoulders. The moment his boots hit the ground, Malcolm forced his body to steady itself, forced the tremor in his limbs to vanish, forced himself to bury the raw, burning storm still clawing at his insides. Not here. Not now. They wanted a reaction. They had gotten one when Rex fell. They wouldn't get another. Miller smirked as he stepped out, adjusting his belt with casual arrogance, the kind of swagger that came from knowing he could take a life in broad daylight and suffer no consequences. "Welcome to your new home for the night," he drawled, giving Malcolm's shoulder a hard shove toward the station doors. "Try not to get too comfortable." Malcolm didn't respond. He kept his posture straight, his eyes forward, his mind reeling, calculating, searching for a way through the fog of rage that had settled in his chest like a dying fire, still smoldering, waiting to ignite. The booking process was a blur of cold fingers snapping off his cuffs, of ink pressed against his skin, of fluorescent lights humming above him, as the weight of everything settled in his bones. His mugshot was taken with Rex's blood still on his clothes, on his hands. The evidence of his loss turned into nothing more than another box checked on a form that meant nothing. They led him to a holding cell, a small, stale room that smelled of sweat and old regret, its walls lined with the ghosts of men who had sat there before him, staring at the same cracks in the ceiling, wondering how they had ended up on the wrong side of justice. Malcolm didn't sit. He didn't pace. He didn't close his eyes. He waited. Time blurred. Minutes bled into hours. The anger didn't fade, but it shifted, cooling, hardening into something different, something more dangerous. And then the door opened. A familiar voice. Firm, clipped, burning with barely restrained fury. "Get your damn hands off of him, Jasmine." Malcolm exhaled slowly as his sister stormed into the room, her heels striking the tile like gunfire. Her presence a force of nature that even the officers escorting her seemed reluctant to challenge. She was dressed in full defense mode. Power suit, sharp angles, a glare so sharp it could slice through bone. "You're done holding him," she snapped, shoving a stack of papers into the nearest officer's chest without looking at him. "Unless you want the lawsuit of the century, I suggest you unchain your egos from this moment and let him walk out of here." Calloway appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Relax, sweetheart," he said, voice oozing false charm. "We were just having a conversation with your brother. Had a little misunderstanding earlier." Jasmine turned so fast her hair barely had time to catch up. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her tone a loaded weapon. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Miller leaned against the doorway, grinning. "He got aggressive, ma'am. We had to make sure things didn't escalate." Jasmine's laugh was sharp, humorless. "You mean you shot his dog, assaulted him, and threw him in a cell because you thought he looked out of place in his own neighborhood?" Calloway shrugged. "Could have gone worse." The temperature in the room dropped. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all night, but laced with something that made even Calloway's smirk flicker. "It will." For the first time, the officers hesitated, just for a second. Then Calloway snorted, shaking his head. "Take him home, counselor, but I'd tell him to keep his head down if I were you. This city isn't too kind to troublemakers." Jasmine's eyes burned, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned to Malcolm, her fingers wrapping around his wrist, her grip firm, steady, the first anchor he had felt since this nightmare began. "Let's go," she said softly. Malcolm followed her out, past the other officers who barely spared him a glance, past the walls that had already erased him, past the men who believed they had won. The night air hit his skin, but it didn't feel freeing. Nothing did. Jasmine exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face before turning to him, her expression shifting from fury to something heavier, something laced with grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know what he meant to you." Malcolm's jaw tensed, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The words weren't there, not in a language that could express what had been ripped from him. But Jasmine wasn't done. "You need to let me handle this," she continued, her voice firm, pleading. "You need to let me take this through the courts, through the media, through every legal damn avenue we have." "Do not. It won't work," Malcolm said quietly. Jasmine hesitated. "Malcolm, it won't work." And they both knew it. The police owned the system. They controlled the narrative. They had already set it in motion, already buried any chance of accountability beneath layers of bureaucracy and false reports, and manufactured justifications. The courts wouldn't save him. The law wouldn't save him. Justice wasn't coming. Not the kind Jasmine was hoping for. And so, Malcolm did something he hadn't done in years. He let go of the idea that the system would protect him. And he let something else settle in. Something colder, something inevitable. Days later, the house was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, not the sort of quiet that came with solitude or rest. This was absence, the kind of silence that clawed at the edges of a man's mind, that sat heavy in the air, pressing in from all sides, the kind that made the world feel off balance, like something had been torn away and left nothing in its place. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, staring at his hands, his fingers resting loosely around a coffee mug he hadn't touched. Rex's leash sat coiled on the counter. The absence of weight at his side, of movement in the room, of quiet, steady breaths that weren't his own, left a void so deep it felt like the floor itself would give way beneath him. Jasmine stood by the window, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "You haven't slept." Malcolm didn't answer. "You haven't eaten either," she added, her voice soft, careful. Still, no response. Jasmine sighed, dragging a hand down her face before stepping closer. "I know what you're thinking." That made him exhale, a slow, humorless sound that barely registered as a laugh. He finally looked up at her, his eyes dark, tired, hollow in a way that hadn't been there before. "Do you?" Jasmine hesitated, something unreadable flickering across her face. They had always been close, had always understood each other in ways most siblings didn't. But now, as she looked at him, as she saw the shift that had taken place, she wasn't sure if she recognized what she saw. "I know you," she said carefully. "I know how you operate. I know that if something doesn't make sense, if something is broken, you fix it. If there's an enemy, you eliminate it. That's how you've always been. That's why you were so good at what you did." Her voice softened. "But this isn't a battlefield, Malcolm." His jaw clenched. "Feels like one." She exhaled, stepping closer, lowering her voice as if gentleness alone could reach him, could pull him back from wherever he was slipping into. "Listen to me. The system is slow, but that doesn't mean it's useless. We're filing a case. I have connections with reporters, activists, watchdogs. This isn't going to just go away. People will hear about what happened. The pressure will build, and they'll have to act." Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "No, they won't. Yes, they will. It takes time, but it works. They already closed the internal investigation, Jasmine." Her breath hitched, her hands curling into fists. "What?" Malcolm's voice was calm, detached in a way that didn't match the fire in his eyes. "They wrapped it up this morning. No misconduct. No disciplinary action. No charges. Justified force." Jasmine's entire body tensed, her expression twisting between disbelief and fury. "They—" She cut herself off, pacing toward the window, pressing a hand against her forehead as if physically holding back the words that wanted to escape. "Of course they did. Of course they—" She turned back, her voice sharp. "That doesn't mean we're done. We can appeal. We can take this higher. We can—" "No, Jasmine." His voice was steady, final. She shook her head. "No, you don't get to say that. Not after what they did. Not after what they took from you. This isn't over." Malcolm leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers lacing together, his gaze never leaving hers. "They took everything from me in a matter of seconds. But you're telling me to wait, to hope that the same system that let them walk free will suddenly find accountability it's never had before. You're telling me that if I sit still, if I trust the process, maybe in 6 months or a year, there might be a hearing, a slap on the wrist, a forced resignation, maybe. But Jasmine, you and I both know exactly how this plays out." Her throat bobbed, her breath unsteady. "We have to at least try." "I did try," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "I tried the moment they put me in cuffs. I tried when I told them I lived here. I tried when I showed them my ID. I tried when I stood still, when I spoke politely, when I didn't resist, when I begged them to see me as human. I tried, Jasmine." His voice faltered, just slightly, and Rex still died. "And I still went to jail." Jasmine clenched her jaw, her eyes shining with something between frustration and sorrow. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I'm done trying." She stepped forward, lowering herself into the chair across from him, searching his face. "What are you saying?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating the weight of the words before speaking them aloud. "I think you already know." Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, Malcolm, I'm not asking you to be okay with it, he cut in, his voice still impossibly calm, too steady for what he was about to say. I'm just telling you where I stand, and where this is going. Jasmine's breath trembled, her eyes searching his face for something. Doubt, hesitation, a sign that there was still a path she could lead him down, still a way to turn him from whatever was unfolding in his mind. But she saw nothing, just resolve, cold, unshakable, unwavering. She swallowed hard, her voice quiet, brittle. If you do this, there's no coming back. Malcolm held her gaze. I don't want to come back. A silence stretched between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Jasmine exhaled, slow and measured, before standing, smoothing out her jacket with steady hands. I'll call you tomorrow. Malcolm nodded. She hesitated for just a second longer, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides as if she wanted to reach out, wanted to grab him, shake him, pull him back to the brother she knew before all of this. But instead, she turned and walked out the door. Malcolm waited until the sound of her car engine faded into the distance before he rose from his seat, moving toward the counter. His hands hovered over Rex's leash. His fingers brushed over the worn leather, tracing the familiar feel of it, the weight of memory embedded in every inch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picked it up and coiled it tightly in his palm, not as a leash, not as something that would ever be used again for what it was meant for, but as a reminder, a promise. A war was coming, and Malcolm was ready. The bar sat at the edge of the city, far from the well-lit streets where Calloway's uniform still carried weight. Here, nobody cared that he was a cop. Here, he could be exactly the kind of man he had always been. Reckless, arrogant, unafraid. Malcolm had been watching him for days, learning the rhythm of his vices, the way he drifted into the same seat at the bar like clockwork, the way he leaned in too close to women who weren't his wife, the way he tossed back whiskey like it was water, drowning himself in the filth of his own existence. He had no idea he was being hunted. Malcolm sat in the corner of the bar, hood low, his drink untouched as he watched Calloway stumble his way through another night of indulgence. The man was predictable, and predictability was a weakness. He had parked in the same alley behind the bar, the one with no security cameras, no streetlights, the perfect place for a man to disappear for a few minutes without anyone noticing. Malcolm was going to make sure Calloway disappeared just long enough for his world to start crumbling. Calloway laughed loudly, a crude, obnoxious sound, slapping the back of the bartender like they were old friends. He swayed slightly, his balance compromised from the 5 drinks he had already downed. His words slurred but confident, like a man who believed nothing bad could ever happen to him. Malcolm exhaled slowly, finishing his drink in one slow sip before rising to his feet. He let Calloway move first, let him feel the false sense of security that came from being in familiar territory. Calloway didn't even glance around as he stumbled toward the back exit, muttering something under his breath as he pushed through the door, stepping into the dark alley beyond. The moment the door swung shut behind him, the game began. Malcolm followed, silent as a shadow, his breath steady, his pulse slow, his muscles coiled with the kind of patience only men like him knew how to wield. Calloway had no idea he wasn't alone. The cop fumbled with his keys, cursing as they slipped from his fingers, clattering against the pavement. He grunted, leaning forward to retrieve them. Malcolm struck. A hard, precise kick to the ribs, sending Calloway crashing to the ground, his head bouncing against the pavement with a sickening crack. The man let out a sharp gasp, hands scrambling against the concrete, his confusion instant and absolute. What the— Malcolm didn't let him finish. A steel-toed boot slammed into his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a fish on dry land. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, no mercy. Malcolm grabbed Calloway by the collar, dragging him up just to slam him back down, the back of his skull bouncing off the asphalt again, dazing him, leaving him too disoriented to fight back. Calloway groaned, his body limp, his fingers clawing at Malcolm's arms, desperate, weak. "Who?" Malcolm grabbed a fistful of his hair and yanked his head back, bringing his mouth close to the man's ear. His voice was a whisper, low and deadly. "You don't get to know who I am," he murmured. "Not yet." Calloway shuddered. Malcolm released him, letting him drop hard against the pavement. He stood over him, watching as the man tried to move, tried to make sense of what was happening, tried to pull himself together. It was useless. Malcolm crouched down, tilting his head slightly, his voice still eerily calm. "You like to play judge, jury, and executioner, don't you?" he mused. "It's easy when you've got a badge, isn't it? Easy when you've got a system that protects you, when no one ever fights back." Calloway sucked in a sharp, trembling breath, his hands curling into fists. You're dead. You hear me?" His voice wavered, shaking beneath the bravado. "You don't—" The next punch was swift, calculated, sending blood splattering across the pavement. "That was for all my black brothers and sisters you've harassed and beat," he said. Calloway choked, spitting red onto the ground, his body curling inward. Malcolm let the silence stretch, let the pain settle in deep before speaking again. His voice was softer this time, but no less terrifying. "This is the last time you ever walk away from something like this," he said. "Because after tonight, I'm going to take everything from you. Your job, your reputation, your family, your safety. And when there's nothing left, you'll wake up every day knowing that somewhere out there, I'm watching you." Calloway let out a choked, ragged breath. Malcolm leaned in. "This is just the beginning." And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Calloway remained on the ground, bleeding, shaking, his heart pounding with a terror he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. Calloway lay on the ground, his body aching in ways he had never experienced before. Pain was something he had always inflicted, never something he had to endure. But now, the pavement beneath him felt like quicksand, every attempt to move sending sharp reminders of the blows he had taken. His ribs screamed with each shallow breath, his face was slick with his own blood, and his head throbbed so violently he thought he might pass out. His fingers trembled as he pressed his palms against the pavement, trying to push himself up. His vision swam, streetlights blurring into hazy orange halos, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of traffic from the main road. The alley was empty, silent. Whoever had done this to him was gone. And yet, Calloway felt no relief. The man's words echoed in his skull, low and measured, cutting deeper than any of the blows he had landed. "This is the last time you ever walk away from something like this. Because after tonight, I'm going to take everything from you." A slow, unsteady breath rasped through Calloway's throat, his stomach twisting in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. There had been something unnatural about the way the man spoke. So certain, so absolute, like he wasn't just making threats, but promising inevitabilities. And the worst part? Calloway believed him. With a grunt, he forced himself upright, his legs shaking beneath his weight, his back pressed against the brick wall for support, his fingers fumbling against his pocket for his phone. The screen was cracked, smeared with blood, but it still worked. He dialed. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Jesus, Calloway, it's 1 a.m. Miller's voice grumbled, thick with exhaustion. "What the hell do you—" "I need backup," Calloway rasped, cutting him off, his breath uneven. "Now." There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. "Where are you?" "Back alley behind O'Shea's," Calloway muttered, reaching up to wipe the blood from his brow. "Some son of a bitch jumped me." Didn't see his face. He hesitated, the words getting caught in his throat. He had never hesitated before. He what? Miller's voice was sharper now, more alert. Calloway swallowed, licking his cracked lips. He knew me, Miller. He knew my name. He knew everything. Another pause. Longer this time. Everything? He said. Calloway exhaled, squeezing his eyes shut for a moment before opening them again. He said he's going to ruin me, that he's going to take everything from me. Miller scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease beneath the dismissal. Probably some drunk idiot trying to talk big. You're still standing, aren't you? Calloway forced a bitter laugh, but it felt hollow. You don't get it. This guy wasn't some thug looking for a fight. This was different. Miller groaned, the sound of rustling sheets and movement coming through the phone. All right, sit tight. I'll be there in 10. The call ended. Calloway leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the dark sky above him, his chest tightening with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just pain. It was fear. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. Miller arrived exactly when he said he would, pulling into the alley with his unmarked car, headlights washing over Calloway's battered form. He stepped out, dressed in casual clothes, his badge hanging from his belt, his gun at his hip. "The hell happened to you?" Miller muttered, taking in the sight of him. Calloway groaned, pushing himself off the wall. "You think I did this to myself?" Miller gave him a once-over before glancing around the alley, scanning the shadows. "You said you didn't see his face?" "No," Calloway muttered, flexing his fingers, wincing at the soreness. "He came out of nowhere, moved fast, knew exactly where to hit. Military fast." Miller frowned. "So what? Some pissed-off veteran with a grudge?" Calloway exhaled sharply. "I don't know, but he wasn't just some random guy looking to start trouble. He knew me. He knew about us. He knew what we've done." Miller's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Then we find him." Calloway let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah? And how do you plan on doing that? We don't even have a description." Miller stepped closer, voice low. "Someone comes after us. We shut it down. That's how this works. Whoever this guy is, he made a mistake. He left you alive. That means he left an opening." Calloway was silent for a moment, then nodded, forcing himself to straighten. Yeah, you're right." Miller glanced at his phone. "I'll make some calls, see if we can find anything." Calloway nodded again, but his mind was still trapped in the alley, still replaying every word his attacker had spoken. "This is just the beginning." Miller clapped him on the shoulder, but Calloway barely felt it. Somewhere out there, the man who had done this to him was watching, waiting, planning. And Calloway knew, with a certainty that sent ice through his veins, that he had already lost control. Malcolm had expected them to retaliate, but what interested him was how they would respond. He had anticipated panic, the erratic desperation of men who believed themselves untouchable only to realize that something unseen, something stronger, had set its sights on them. They had spent years preying on the weak, operating under the illusion that their authority was absolute, that their uniforms shielded them from consequences. Now, stripped of their security, forced to reckon with the reality that they were being hunted, they had no idea where to begin. So they did what men like them always did. They found someone else to blame. Malcolm sat in his car across the street, engine off, his seat reclined just enough to avoid drawing attention. His camera lens was trained on Calloway and Miller as they moved with the kind of aggression that only came from fear. They weren't handling this the way an officer would handle an investigation. No interviews, no proper protocol, no reports being filed. This was retaliation. Calloway was still limping slightly, a bruise creeping from beneath his collar, his face stiff with pain. But it wasn't just the beating that had broken him. It was the unknown. He had been attacked in a way he had never experienced before. Helpless, powerless, beaten in the shadows without ever seeing the man who had done it. And that had shaken him deeper than any bruise ever could. They had stopped outside a rundown boxing gym, the kind that never advertised, the kind built for fighters who didn't just train for sport, but for survival. It wasn't surprising. Calloway and Miller had a long history of targeting strong, outspoken black men in their precinct. Men they viewed as a challenge. Men who never bowed their heads. Malcolm's eyes flicked toward the entrance of the gym as the door swung open, revealing a familiar face, Terrence Briggs. Tall, built like a linebacker, his presence commanded attention without effort. He was a well-known figure in the community, a former amateur fighter turned youth mentor, one of the few men who had always stood up against exactly the kind of officers Calloway and Miller were. Malcolm remembered reading about the time Briggs had filed excessive force complaints against them 2 years ago after a violent, baseless arrest. The charges had been buried beneath red tape, dismissed as resisting arrest. But Malcolm had seen the photos, the bruises on Briggs's ribs, the split in his eyebrow, the raw abrasions on his wrists from the cuffs that had been tightened just a little too much. And now, Calloway and Miller were back, staring him down like they were searching for something, their eyes sharp, expectant. Malcolm lifted his camera, zooming in. The conversation was tense from the start. Calloway stood too close, his arms crossed, his chin tilted upward in the kind of posture that dared a man to retaliate. Miller kept shifting his weight, glancing at the street like he expected someone to be watching. Briggs wasn't intimidated. He never had been. He leaned against the doorframe of the gym, wiping sweat from his brow, his expression unimpressed as Calloway spoke. Malcolm couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to. The body language told him everything. Calloway was demanding something, his gestures sharp, impatient. Briggs shook his head, then smirked, saying something that made Miller step forward, teeth bared in frustration. Briggs pushed off the doorframe, standing taller, making it clear that he wasn't backing down. Malcolm adjusted the lens, capturing every second. Miller took another step, but Calloway put a hand on his chest, stopping him. He turned back to Briggs, his expression darkening. A warning. Briggs didn't flinch. He just laughed. Calloway's hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing else. He turned on his heel, motioning for Miller to follow. They left without another word, their shoulders stiff, their pace tight. Malcolm exhaled, lowering the camera just slightly. So, that was their plan? They had no leads, no idea who was responsible, so they were going to find the strongest black men in the community and shake them down, waiting to see who flinched. Cowards. Malcolm watched as Briggs muttered something under his breath, shaking his head before heading back inside the gym. Calloway and Miller, however, weren't finished. They got into their car, and Malcolm tailed them, keeping 3 cars behind, always in their blind spots. They weren't looking for him. They weren't careful. The next stop was the apartment complex where Dwayne Carter lived. Malcolm knew that name. Carter had been another victim of Calloway and Miller's abuse, pulled over on a bogus traffic stop 6 months ago, dragged out of his car, accused of having a weapon that had never existed. He had been arrested, beaten in the holding cell, charged with assaulting an officer, even though the only injuries that night had been his. Malcolm sat in silence, watching as Calloway and Miller approached the front door, knocking hard enough to rattle the frame. The door opened after a few seconds, and Carter appeared, rubbing his eyes, clearly just waking up. They didn't waste time. Calloway shoved the door open wider, stepping inside uninvited. Carter tensed, confusion morphing into irritation, but he didn't fight back. He knew better. Miller entered behind him, blocking the exit, forcing Carter back toward his own kitchen. Malcolm adjusted his camera, zooming in through the window. Their expressions were sharp, accusing. Carter was defensive, hands raised slightly in that universal sign of compliance. They were interrogating him. Malcolm's fingers tightened around the camera. Calloway said something, then pointed at Carter's arms, his physique, his posture. They were profiling him in real time, looking at his build, his strength, already deciding that it made him guilty of something. Carter's jaw clenched, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Calloway's face darkened instantly. Miller took a step forward, invading Carter's space. Malcolm took a deep breath, steadying his hands. He didn't need to intervene, not yet. This wasn't about stopping them in the moment. This was about documenting everything. He had everything he needed. They were digging their own graves, and Malcolm was going to bury them. Malcolm had followed them long enough to know their methods. Their fear had turned to desperation, and desperation made them reckless. They had no suspects, no direction, no tangible way to fight back against an enemy they couldn't see. So instead, they did what cowards did best. They attacked blindly, hoping to hit something. He watched from 3 cars behind as Calloway and Miller drove in tight circles through the city, stopping only to intimidate men they had once arrested. Men they assumed might be capable of the kind of calculated brutality that had left Calloway broken and afraid. But fear had made them impatient, and impatience had made them sloppy. Malcolm knew what was coming before they did. They had been targeting men like Briggs and Carter because they had power, physical strength, the ability to fight back. But when that didn't get them any answers, they would switch tactics. They would look for someone else. Someone like him. He saw it in the way Miller hesitated before turning onto a familiar street, in the way Calloway leaned forward, eyes narrowed as the house came into view. They thought they were being subtle, but Malcolm had been waiting for this moment. He had been preparing. They were coming for him, and they had no idea that he wanted them to. Malcolm had spent 2 nights preparing the house, not the obvious security measures. No, that would make them suspicious. Instead, he had staged it in a way that made him look vulnerable. A half-full whiskey bottle left visible on the coffee table, unopened mail stacked haphazardly on the kitchen counter. A gun safe, carefully left slightly ajar, just enough to suggest negligence. The cameras had been positioned perfectly, hidden in plain sight, in places no cop would ever think to check, because they never thought they needed to. The front porch light was left on, the side gate unlocked. An invitation. Malcolm sat in his living room, his phone resting on his knee, his breathing steady as the knock came, sharp, demanding. He rose slowly, keeping his movements relaxed, keeping the illusion intact. The cameras were already recording. Another knock, this time harder. Malcolm unlocked the door, swinging it open to reveal Calloway and Miller standing on his porch. Malcolm said, keeping his voice even, "Something I can help you with?" Calloway smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was no friendliness in it, just the thinly veiled pleasure of a man who thought he was back in control. "Mind if we come in?" Calloway asked. Malcolm leaned against the door frame. "That depends. You got a warrant? You gonna shoot me this time instead?" Miller chuckled. "You got something to hide?" Malcolm tilted his head, letting just enough amusement slip into his expression to keep them off guard. "Not at all. But I like to keep things legal. You understand?" Calloway's smirk widened. "Yeah, legal. Funny thing about that, isn't it?" Malcolm said nothing, just waited. And Calloway took the bait. Before Malcolm could react, not that he tried to, Calloway's hand was on his chest, shoving him back into the house. Malcolm staggered, knocking into the side table, the whiskey bottle clattering to the floor. He heard the door click shut behind them. Miller exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You know what's funny, Malcolm? We've been looking into something. Real interesting stuff." Malcolm stayed where he was, keeping his body language relaxed, keeping his expression blank. "That's so." Calloway circled him like a predator that thought its prey was already beaten. "Yeah. See, we've been thinking. The guy who did this to me, he wasn't some street thug. He was trained. The way he moved, the way he hit. Real professional stuff." Malcolm didn't react. "But here's the thing," Calloway continued, taking another slow step forward. "Not a lot of people are trained like that. Unless, of course, they had the right kind of background." Miller leaned in. like Delta Force. Malcolm let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then he did exactly what he had planned. He laughed. It wasn't forced. It wasn't nervous. It was a slow, deep chuckle, one that made Calloway's expression flicker just slightly. The smallest crack in his confidence. "You think I beat your ass?" Malcolm asked, shaking his head, his amusement genuine. "Calloway, if I had, you wouldn't have walked away from it." Miller's jaw tightened, but Calloway recovered, tilting his head. "That's a real interesting response, Malcolm." Malcolm exhaled, rubbing his jaw like he was just another tired man trying to get through a conversation he wasn't interested in. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you two, but I had nothing to do with whatever happened to you." Calloway's smirk returned. "Yeah? Well, see? We don't really believe you." Malcolm saw it before it happened. The shift in weight, the slight tensing of Calloway's shoulder, the way Miller's fingers curled into fists, and he didn't fight it. The first punch landed hard against his ribs, the impact sharp and brutal. Malcolm grunted, stumbling backward. But he didn't resist, didn't defend himself. He let it happen. Another punch, this time to his jaw. His head snapped to the side, pain radiating through his skull. His body wanted to react, to counter, to break them. But he kept his hands loose, his stance slack. Calloway grabbed the collar of his shirt, yanking him upright. "Not so tough now, are you?" Malcolm let his body sag just slightly, breathing heavy, playing the part perfectly. "You done?" he rasped. Miller sneered. "For now." Calloway shoved him hard against the wall, stepping back with a satisfied smirk. "Stay out of our way, Malcolm, because if we find out you had anything to do with this, you're not gonna like how it ends." And just like that, they were gone. Malcolm stayed on the floor for a few seconds, his ribs throbbing, his lips split, his entire body screaming at him for letting them do it. Then, slowly, he got up. He walked to his laptop, pulled up the camera feeds, and there it was, everything he needed. The moment Calloway and Miller had sealed their own fate, Malcolm sat in front of his laptop, the dim glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes as he replayed the footage. The bruises on his face had already started to fade, but the ache in his ribs still lingered, a dull, constant reminder of what he had endured to set this up. Every punch, every shove, every smug insult from Calloway and Miller had been necessary. Now, he was about to make sure it all paid off. He watched as the video played out again. The clarity was perfect. The camera placement had been meticulous, ensuring that there was no ambiguity. The moment Calloway pushed his way inside, the moment Miller closed the door behind him, the moment their arrogance, their unchecked power, was laid bare, Malcolm exhaled slowly. The first step had been getting them to act on instinct. The second was making sure their instincts got them killed. He opened a secured folder on his computer, scanning the collection of files, images, and reports he had compiled over the last few weeks. Every unjustified arrest, every excessive force complaint, every time a victim had been silenced. Calloway and Miller weren't just corrupt officers. They were the rot inside the department, the kind of men who thought power was their birthright. And now, he was going to take it away from them. He drafted the first email, attaching a carefully edited version of the footage. Not everything, not yet, just enough to stir the pot. The footage would circulate. It would spread to the right eyes, the ones inside the department who had been waiting for an excuse to purge their ranks, but had never had enough evidence. Malcolm wasn't giving them evidence. He was giving them a weapon. He leaned back, cracking his knuckles, exhaling slowly. The emails were sent. The storm was coming. But first, Miller still needed a beating. Malcolm had spent days studying Miller's schedule, tracking him the same way he had Calloway. But unlike Calloway, Miller wasn't reckless. He was angry, twitchy, looking over his shoulder, gripping his gun a little tighter than before. Calloway had taken the first blow, and Miller knew he was next, but that wouldn't save him. Malcolm watched from the driver's seat of his car, parked a safe distance away from a bar Miller had been frequenting for the last few nights. Not a place cops usually drank. This was a dive, a hole in the wall where no one asked questions. Miller had been there for 3 hours. Malcolm knew why. The man was unraveling. The department had been whispering. There were rumors that Internal Affairs had been asking about Calloway, about past arrests, about misconduct complaints. Miller wasn't stupid. He knew if Calloway went down, he was going with him. Malcolm had made sure of that. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his mind already working through the next steps. He didn't need to trick Miller into a fight the way he had with Calloway. He just needed to wait until the bastard was drunk enough to make a mistake. And Miller was getting there. The door to the bar swung open, and Miller stumbled out, shoulders hunched, tension etched into every line of his body. He looked like a man walking toward a noose. Malcolm exhaled slowly, rolling his neck. It was time. He exited the car, keeping his steps measured, silent. He let Miller move first, waiting, watching, following. The drunk cop wasn't heading home. He was too restless, too pissed off. Instead, he was walking through the alley behind the bar, a shortcut to the parking lot where his car was waiting. Malcolm followed him into the dark. He had chosen the location. Now, he was choosing the moment. He let Miller take a few more steps before finally speaking. Long night? Miller froze. Malcolm saw the way the man's shoulders tensed, his body going stiff, his instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. Slowly, Miller turned, his eyes narrowing in confusion before flickering with recognition. "You," he muttered. Malcolm didn't move. "You look tired, Miller." Miller's fingers twitched near his waistband, near the gun he had no doubt been keeping close since Calloway's attack. "What the hell do you want?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, keeping his voice calm. "I want you to understand something." Miller sneered. "Yeah? And what's that?" Malcolm took a slow step forward. "You're done." Miller stiffened. The silence between them stretched, thick, electric. "Then," Miller scoffed, shaking his head, forcing out a laugh, "you're real confident for a guy who let us use him as a punching bag." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "Yeah, funny thing about that." Miller's smirk faltered just slightly. Malcolm took another step forward. "Calloway was just the beginning," he said, his voice softer now, almost casual. "But you? I'm going to take my time with you." Miller's nostrils flared, his hand jerking toward his gun. He never got the chance to pull it. Malcolm struck first, fast, precise. And then, Miller was falling. The last thing he saw was Malcolm, standing over him, waiting for him to get up so they could really get started. Miller hit the pavement hard, the impact rattling through his bones, his lungs gasping for air that refused to come. The moment his body crumpled, he knew. This wasn't like Calloway's beating. This wasn't a message. This was personal. He tried to push himself up, but before he could move, a boot slammed down on his wrist, grinding his hand into the rough asphalt. Pain flared white-hot up his arm, and he let out a strangled grunt. "Stay down," Malcolm said. Miller recognized the voice. Even through the haze of adrenaline and the ringing in his ears, he knew exactly who it was. And for the first time in his miserable, pathetic life, he felt real fear. He struggled anyway, his instincts kicking in, years of unchecked aggression telling him to fight, to take control, to dominate. But he was too slow, too drunk, too reliant on a badge that wasn't here to save him. Malcolm moved first, his fist driving into Miller's ribs. Hard, a perfect, precise strike between bone and muscle, designed to hurt, designed to linger. Miller choked on the breath that had been ripped from him, wheezing as his body seized from the impact. "You remember me now, don't you?" Malcolm murmured, his voice impossibly calm, measured. Miller coughed, trying to twist free, but Malcolm grabbed him by the collar, yanking him upright just enough so they were face to face. "Look at me," Malcolm ordered. Miller's swollen eyes blinked up at him, his breath ragged, his lips cracked with blood. Recognition flickered, followed by horror. "You," Miller rasped. Malcolm's grip tightened. "Say my name." Miller swallowed, his throat clicking in the silence. "You don't want to, do you?" Malcolm continued. "Because if you say my name, it means you know exactly why this is happening. It means you remember what you did." Miller's jaw clenched, defiant even as his body betrayed him, shaking beneath Malcolm's grip. Malcolm exhaled sharply, then leaned in, voice low, deadly. "You shot my dog." Miller flinched. "You remember now, don't you?" Malcolm continued, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to a child. "I bet it felt real good at the time, didn't it? Real easy. Just another kill, another thing you could do, because no one was going to stop you." Miller coughed, his body shaking harder now. Whether from pain or terror, Malcolm didn't care. "But I'm not like the people you target, Miller. You should have known that." Malcolm's grip tightened on his shirt, his voice turning cold. "I don't forget. I don't forgive. And I don't let things go." Miller tried to speak, tried to form words, but Malcolm didn't give him the chance. The next punch shattered his nose. Miller let out a garbled yell, blood gushing down his face, his body spasming from the sheer force of the impact. His head lolled back against the pavement, a wet, gurgling sound escaping his lips. Malcolm didn't stop. He made sure Miller felt every bit of what Rex had felt. Every kick, every punch, every ounce of suffering Miller had inflicted on others was repaid tenfold. By the time Malcolm finally let him go, Miller was a heap of broken flesh and shattered arrogance. But Malcolm wasn't finished. He crouched down beside him, his breath steady, his voice quiet. "This is just the beginning." Miller let out a low, trembling whimper. Malcolm's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "Remember how I said, I don't forget?" Miller didn't answer. He was barely conscious. Malcolm stood, stepping back, leaving Miller sprawled in the filth of his own blood and failure. Good. And then, just like that, he was gone. By the time Miller clawed his way back to his car, Malcolm was exactly where he needed to be, inside a fully booked casino. It had been part of the plan all along. Malcolm walked through the lobby, passing security, letting the cameras catch every step, every angle, every detail of his face. He made small talk with the pit bosses, played a few hands of blackjack, even let himself lose a couple of rounds just to make sure he was memorable. Then, for the final touch, he walked right up to the bar, tapped his knuckles against the counter, and ordered the strongest drink they had. "Rough night?" the bartender asked. Malcolm let out a short, easy chuckle. "Something like that." He lifted the glass in a small toast, took a long sip, and smiled. Let the whole damn casino see him. Let every camera record him. Let Miller crawl his way back to the precinct and scream his name into the void. Because it wouldn't matter. By the time the cops pulled the security footage, by the time they went looking for proof, all they'd find was Malcolm Hayes sitting at a bar, sipping whiskey, surrounded by 100 people who could swear he hadn't left their sight all night. Miller knew the truth. Calloway would know too, but they couldn't prove a damn thing. That was the beauty of it. Malcolm drove home with the calm precision of a man who already knew what was waiting for him. He had played his part, set every piece exactly where it needed to be. The next move wasn't his. It was theirs. The flashing red and blue lights were visible before he even turned onto his street. 2 patrol cars parked at the curb, 4 officers standing near his driveway. One of them was already looking toward his approaching vehicle. Malcolm exhaled slowly, not in surprise, not in fear, but in quiet satisfaction. They had taken the bait. He pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine. His movements were controlled, deliberate, designed to show no resistance. The officers were already moving before he had even stepped out of the car. "Malcolm Hayes," one of them said, voice sharp, authoritative, rehearsed. Malcolm gave them an easy nod. "That's me. Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped onto the pavement, his expression unreadable. One of the cops, a stocky officer with a tight jaw and an even tighter grip on his belt, stepped forward. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Malcolm's lips curled slightly. "You sure you want to do this?" The officer's face twitched, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but it was gone just as fast. "Do it now!" Malcolm shrugged, then turned, letting them cuff him without so much as a word of protest. The cold steel bit into his wrists, but Malcolm barely felt it. Everything was happening exactly as it needed to. They guided him toward the patrol car, one of them reciting his rights. But Malcolm wasn't listening. His focus was on the house across the street, the one where an older woman, his longtime neighbor, stood on her porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She had seen him come home. She had seen the cops waiting for him. And when the time came, she would tell them exactly that. It was all part of the plan. The drive to the station was uneventful. The officers spoke, but Malcolm didn't respond. He just sat in silence, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. By the time they pulled into the station's back lot, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. The department was tense, restless. Something was coming, and they all knew it. They led him inside, past rows of desks where officers glanced up from paperwork, their gazes flickering between Malcolm and the ones escorting him, some confused, some expectant. He was taken to a small, windowless room, the kind that had seen countless interrogations before him. The walls were bare, the table scratched from years of use. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows. They left him there. Malcolm waited. 15 minutes passed before the door opened again. Captain Holt stepped inside, his presence alone enough to change the air in the room. He was a man who carried authority like a weapon, who never spoke without knowing his words carried weight. He dropped a file onto the table and took a seat across from Malcolm, his fingers tapping once against the surface. "You know why you're here?" Holt asked. Malcolm leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "Not a clue." Holt exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He opened the file, flipping through the first few pages before sliding it toward Malcolm. Inside were pictures, images of Miller and Calloway, beaten, bruised, humiliated. One of Miller lying in his own blood. Another of Calloway staggering into the precinct, barely able to stand. Malcolm didn't blink. Holt watched him carefully. 2 officers were attacked in the past week, both of them beaten within an inch of their lives, both of them convinced they know exactly who did it. Malcolm raised a brow. "That's so." Holt leaned forward slightly. "You want to tell me where you were last night?" Malcolm smiled. There it was, the question he had been waiting for. He let the silence stretch before answering. "Sure, I was at the Bellagio. Casino floor, main bar. You'll find the security footage matches up exactly with the time Miller was getting his ass handed to him." "Funny how that works, huh?" Holt's expression didn't change, but Malcolm caught the slight flicker in his eyes. "You think this is a game?" Holt asked. Malcolm shrugged. "No, but I think you're wasting my time." Holt didn't respond. Instead, he reached into the file again, pulling out another document, this one a printed email. Malcolm already knew what it was. The leak had begun. Holt's jaw tightened as he placed the paper in front of Malcolm. The first batch of footage, Calloway and Miller breaking into Malcolm's home, the body cam failures, the violent arrests, the buried reports, had already started making its way through the right channels. By now, journalists would have it. Whistleblower groups, the public defenders who had been fighting against the corruption in the department for years, but had never had solid proof. Now, they did. And it was all coming out while Malcolm sat here, cuffed to a chair, looking completely and utterly untouchable. Holt stared at him, his fingers pressed together. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you're making a mistake." Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "No, you made the mistake." Holt's fingers twitched, but he kept his voice even. You think this ends with them? You think this doesn't go higher? Malcolm smirked. Oh, I'm counting on it. A knock on the door interrupted them. A younger officer peeked inside, looking hesitant. Captain, you need to see this. Holt turned, irritation flashing across his face. Not now, sir. It's about— The officer hesitated, then lowered his voice. It's everywhere. The footage. The emails. The IA reports. It's already on the news. For the first time, Malcolm saw it. The moment Holt realized he had lost, the captain's jaw clenched. He turned back to Malcolm, but there was nothing left to say. The door opened fully, and a second officer stepped in. Sir, we need to release him. Holt didn't move. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. You should uncuff me now. Holt's fists clenched at his sides. But he knew the damage was already done. A few moments later, the cuffs clicked open. Malcolm stood, rubbing his wrists, then straightened his shirt. He gave Holt one last look. Next time, Malcolm said, voice low, almost amused, pick better men. Then he walked out, and outside the station, the world was already burning. Malcolm stepped out of the precinct into a world that had already turned against the men who once ruled it. It had only taken hours, but the shift was absolute. The moment the footage had gone live, the break-in, the assault, the history of corruption, the proof of cover-ups, there was no stopping the storm. It spread faster than the department could contain, igniting social media, flooding news stations, pulling reporters to the front doors of precincts, demanding statements that no one inside was prepared to give. And at the center of it all, the name on every headline, Malcolm Hayes, not as a suspect, not as a criminal, as the man who had exposed the rot. Now, as he stood on the precinct steps, he wasn't the one being hunted. The real criminals were. A swarm of journalists pushed forward the moment he appeared, cameras flashing, microphones stretching toward him. The air was electric, the shouts blending into an incoherent roar of questions. Mr. Hayes, do you have anything to say about the footage of the officers attacking you in your own home? Do you feel vindicated now that the truth is out? Malcolm ignored them. Instead, his gaze locked onto the two men standing on the sidewalk, surrounded by reporters, caught in the chaos of their own downfall. Calloway. Miller. The former stood rigid, his usual arrogance replaced with thinly veiled panic. Miller, on the other hand, was barely holding himself together, his face still marked from the beating, his swollen lip pressed into a tight line. They looked at Malcolm, and Malcolm looked right back. It was the first time they had been forced to face him without power, without their badges acting as shields, without the certainty that they were untouchable. And they knew it. Malcolm stepped forward, moving through the crowd as the reporters realized what was happening. Their cameras now trained on the moment, the confrontation everyone had been waiting for. For once, Calloway had no words. Malcolm stopped just feet away from them, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than anything he could have said. Miller was the first to crack. "You set us up," he spat, voice hoarse, wild. "This whole damn thing." Malcolm smiled. Slow, deliberate. "You did this to yourself." Miller flinched at the words, rage flashing across his face. He stepped forward. A reflex, a remnant of the old days, back when intimidation had weight. But the moment he moved, the reporters surged in closer, the world watching, waiting, and he realized, too late, that there was nothing left to intimidate Malcolm with. Not anymore. Calloway let out a bitter breath, his shoulders tight. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Enjoy what?" Calloway's jaw clenched. "Your little moment. This won't last forever." Malcolm chuckled, and it was the sound of a man who had already won, because he had. "This isn't a moment," he said softly. Calloway's nostrils flared. "This is the rest of your life." Malcolm continued, his voice steady. "Certain, you don't come back from this. Neither of you. There's no promotion waiting for you, no cushy retirement, no friends in high places who are going to sweep this under the rug. You're done." Miller exhaled sharply through his nose, his whole body screaming with the need to lash out, to push, to fight. But there was no one left to fight for him, no one left to cover for him, no one left to protect him. Malcolm turned slightly, glancing toward the cameras, making sure the world could see them. Then he leaned in just enough for only the two of them to hear. "You two always thought you were the strongest ones in the room." His voice was soft, calm, mocking. "Turns out, you were the weakest." Calloway exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering toward the reporters, toward the police station behind them, toward the walls closing in from all sides. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Malcolm stepped back. "See you around, boys." Then, without another glance, he turned and walked away, leaving them to drown in the ruin they had built with their own hands. Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his living room, the remote in his hand, flipping through the channels. Every station had the same story. Calloway and Miller officially terminated from the force. No pension, no severance, no quiet exits. The department had rushed to distance itself, throwing them under the bus with record-breaking speed. The police chief had given a cold, scripted press conference, condemning their actions, swearing change. It was pathetic. It was perfect. Malcolm sipped his drink as the screen cut to a live shot of Calloway, pushing through a mob of journalists outside his home, his face tight with barely contained rage. "What do you have to say about the accusations against you?" one reporter asked. Calloway didn't answer. "How do you respond to the leaked evidence of your misconduct?" another pressed. Still nothing. The camera angle shifted slightly, and Malcolm caught a glimpse of Miller standing beside him, his expression a mask of barely restrained fury. Good. Let them feel it, the way he had felt it, the way every victim before him had felt it. The camera cut again, this time to a news anchor, her expression polished, professional. Malcolm Hayes, the man at the center of this case, was briefly taken into custody before being released without charges. Malcolm's lips twitched slightly. Though many have speculated about his possible involvement in the officers' recent attacks, an airtight alibi and multiple witnesses have cleared him of any suspicion. However, when asked for comment, the screen shifted to footage from earlier that day. Malcolm, standing outside the precinct, staring into the cameras. "Do you have any message for the officers who were fired?" He had only said one thing: they got what they deserved. Malcolm clicked the TV off. The city was still buzzing. People were still talking, still demanding more, still waiting for the next steps. The world had turned against them, but Malcolm knew it wasn't over yet. Calloway and Miller had lost their power. They had been humiliated, disgraced, and thrown out of the force. But Malcolm hadn't done all of this just to watch them slink away into the shadows, free to live out their lives in quiet exile. They needed to rot in a cell, and to make that happen, he had to keep pushing. He spent the next week ensuring the evidence wouldn't just linger in the court of public opinion, but would be used to destroy Calloway and Miller completely. He filed formal complaints with Internal Affairs, not just about the attacks on him, but about everything, every false arrest, every unjustified beating, every body cam failure, every abuse of power. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about setting a precedent, making sure that when corrupt officers were caught, they weren't just fired, they were convicted. And once Malcolm put his name on those complaints, once he went public with his testimony, there was no going back. He was stepping into the courtroom. And Calloway and Miller were going to prison. The department tried to resist it. They tried to distance themselves, tried to make Calloway and Miller seem like isolated bad apples. But the public didn't buy it. Every day, protests formed outside the courthouse. Activists demanded that Calloway and Miller be charged. Social media exploded with comparisons of how quickly the system moved against civilians, but stalled when it came to dirty cops. And then, the breaking point. A grand jury was convened. The charges? conspiracy, misconduct, excessive force, aggravated assault, illegal search and seizure. And the most damning of them all, attempted murder. Because Calloway and Miller hadn't just abused their power, they had beaten a man inside his own home, unprovoked, thinking they would never be held accountable. Now they were, and Malcolm was going to stand in court and make sure of it. Malcolm had avoided them since the fallout, hadn't needed to see them again, but they came to him. 2 weeks after the grand jury announcement, he stepped out of a cafe and found Calloway waiting for him. No cameras, no reporters. Just them. Malcolm sighed, tucking his hands into his pockets. "You sure you want to do this?" Calloway's face was hard, his jaw clenched. He looked tired, hollow. "Whatever you think you're doing, it won't stick," Calloway muttered. "You don't know how this works." Malcolm exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No, Calloway, you don't know how this works." Calloway scoffed, but it wasn't real confidence anymore. "You think they're really gonna send us to prison? Cops don't do time." Malcolm took a step closer, voice calm, measured. "They will when I testify." Calloway's jaw twitched. "You think you're a hero?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "I think I'm the reason you're standing here." Scared. The words landed. For the first time in his life, Calloway was afraid. Malcolm leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know what's funny?" Calloway didn't move. "You're not even the worst one." Calloway frowned slightly. Malcolm let the words settle, then stepped back, hands still in his pockets. "See you in court." He walked past him without looking back. Calloway didn't follow. Because he had already lost. The legal battle was set. Calloway and Miller's lawyers tried to fight the charges, tried to spin it as overreach, tried to argue that Malcolm had instigated the situation. But the footage spoke for itself. The evidence was overwhelming. And Malcolm was the key witness. When the trial date was set, the headlines were brutal. Ex-cops face criminal trial in brutality case. Former officers accused of assaulting man in his own home. New era of accountability? The city had never seen something like this, but they were about to. Malcolm adjusted his suit in the mirror, his expression unreadable. The next time he saw Calloway and Miller, it would be in court. And when the judge handed down the sentence, he would be watching. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, their pens tapping against notepads, their cameras poised for the moments that would shape the headlines for weeks. Activists and community leaders sat in silence, their expressions tense, their presence a testament to how much this case meant beyond just one man. At the front, the prosecution team flipped through files, their confidence steady, their strategy set. And then there was Malcolm. Seated at the witness stand, his posture was upright, controlled, his expression unreadable. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't an enemy hiding in the shadows. This was justice unfolding in broad daylight. Across the room, Calloway and Miller sat at the defense table, their faces masks of feigned indifference. But Malcolm saw the tension in their shoulders, the way Miller's fingers twitched at nothing, the way Calloway exhaled just a little too sharply when the judge entered the room. They were scared, and they should be. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a voice that brokered no nonsense, gave the usual instructions. The charges were read aloud, each count landing heavier than the last. Then, the prosecutor stood, adjusting her suit jacket before stepping forward. "Your Honor, the state calls Malcolm Hayes to the stand." Malcolm stood, stepping forward. He raised his right hand, took the oath, sat back down, and then, for the first time since this all began, he spoke his truth where it could never be ignored again. The prosecutor approached, her voice clear, steady. "Mr. Hayes, can you state your full name for the record?" "Malcolm Hayes. And your occupation?" "I work in private security. Formerly U.S. Army. Delta Force." That got a reaction. a ripple in the gallery, a shift in Calloway's expression, a tightening of Miller's jaw. Malcolm didn't look at them. The prosecutor continued, "Mr. Hayes, do you recall the events of the night of March 4th? Malcolm's hands rested on the table in front of him. "I do. Can you walk us through them?" He exhaled slowly, collecting himself. Then he began. "I was walking my dog. His name was Rex. He was a German shepherd, 6 years old, trained, loyal. He was my best friend, my family." The words came easily, too easily, like they had been waiting to be spoken for far too long. "I had just gotten back from a long shift. I liked taking him out late. It was quiet, peaceful. We were just passing through the neighborhood when I saw the headlights behind me. A police cruiser slowed down. I didn't think much of it at first, until they got out." The prosecutor nodded. "Who do you mean by they?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. Officers Calloway and Miller. For the first time, he looked at them. Calloway's jaw twitched. Miller's eyes darted away. The prosecutor stepped closer. "What happened next?" "They told me I didn't belong there." His voice was steady, unwavering. "They asked me where I was going. Asked me for ID. I stayed calm. Told them I lived in the neighborhood. Gave them my address. They saw it on my license. They still didn't believe me." He felt the silence in the room shift. They started pushing. Aggressive questions. Accusations. Calloway kept his hand on his gun the whole time. Malcolm exhaled. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resist. But it didn't matter." The prosecutor nodded. "Can you describe what happened with Rex?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. This part hurt the most. He could tell something was wrong. Dogs, no. He stepped forward. Not aggressively, just protective. "I told him to stay back." He listened. His voice tightened just slightly. But Miller drew his gun anyway. The gallery stilled. "I told him there was no threat. That Rex wasn't a danger." But Miller didn't care. He swallowed, staring straight ahead, refusing to blink. He pulled the trigger anyway. A pause. A long, heavy pause. Malcolm exhaled sharply. One shot. Straight to the chest. Rex didn't even make a sound. He just dropped. The tension in the room was a living thing. The prosecutor gave him a moment. Then, softly, "What happened after that?" Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I lost control. I screamed. I stepped toward him, toward Rex, and that was all the excuse they needed. They tackled me, beat me, tased me." "You were arrested." "Yeah." Malcolm's voice darkened. "They didn't charge me, though, because they had nothing. They held me for hours, then let me go." "And then what happened, Mr. Hayes?" His gaze sharpened. "They came back." More murmurs in the gallery. The prosecutor nodded, stepping closer. "Can you clarify what you mean?" Malcolm's fingers tightened. "Days later, they showed up at my house. No warrant, no cause. Just two men who didn't like that I had challenged them." His voice was low now, steady, deadly. "They forced their way inside. They attacked me in my own home. Do you have evidence of this?" Malcolm glanced at the screen beside them. "It's all on tape." The prosecution team tapped a remote, and the footage played, every second of it. The moment they shoved their way inside. The punches, the threats, the way they thought they were invincible, untouchable. Malcolm didn't watch. He had already lived it. He kept his gaze forward, staring into nothing. Calloway and Miller watched, though, and they knew, just like everyone else in this room, that it was over. The footage ended. The prosecutor turned back to him. "Do you believe Officers Calloway and Miller should be held responsible for their actions?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Why?" He finally turned, looking them dead in the eye. "Because they are criminals." The words landed like a hammer. Miller's fingers curled into fists. Calloway stared at the table, his face tight. The judge exhaled slowly. "I think we've heard enough for today." The bailiff called the court to recess. But Malcolm knew this wasn't a break. This was the beginning of the end. The courtroom felt heavier now, weighed down by the gravity of everything that had been laid bare. The world had seen the truth, and now all that remained was the question of whether the system would do what it had always failed to do: deliver justice. Malcolm sat at the witness table, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly against the polished wood as the defense took their turn. Calloway and Miller's attorney was a sharp-dressed man with a voice that carried the kind of forced confidence only a man with a losing case could muster. He moved toward the center of the room, clearing his throat before looking at Malcolm with the careful calculation of a man grasping at straws. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his tone overly polite, "you've been through quite an ordeal, haven't you?" Malcolm said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than words. The lawyer took that as an invitation to continue. "First, you're accused of something you didn't do. Then, your dog," he hesitated for a fraction of a second, choosing his words carefully, "was shot. Then you were physically assaulted. It must have been traumatic." Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly. "It was." The lawyer nodded, as if that was what he wanted to hear. "Would you say that trauma has influenced your perspective on these events?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, recognizing the play. They were going to try to make him seem emotional, unstable, someone seeking revenge rather than justice. He met the lawyer's gaze, voice steady. "My perspective doesn't change the facts." The lawyer smiled thinly, feigning patience. "Of course, but trauma can shape how we interpret events, don't you think?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "You don't need my interpretation. You have the footage." The words landed like a slap, and the lawyer's expression flickered with frustration. "That footage does not show the full context." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting there's a context where two officers forcing their way into my home and beating me is acceptable?" The murmur in the gallery was immediate. The judge raised a hand for silence. The lawyer's jaw clenched. "I'm suggesting that emotions are running high, and sometimes that can lead to misunderstandings." Malcolm let the silence stretch, then said, voice slow, deliberate, "You think I misunderstood getting punched in the ribs? Or was it the taser? Maybe it was when they dragged me across my own floor?" The jury was watching him carefully now, their expressions shifting. The lawyer knew he had no ground left, but he wasn't ready to concede. "You're a trained fighter, Mr. Hayes. Delta Force. Special Operations. That makes you dangerous, doesn't it?" Malcolm let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Only to people who deserve it." The room stilled. The lawyer took a step back, lips pressing together. No further questions. Miller's hands twitched as he sat beside his lawyer, his face pale, his nerves fraying with every passing second. He had counted on the system protecting him, but he wasn't protected anymore. Calloway, usually the louder of the two, sat stiff, his fingers clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had gone white. He wasn't making eye contact with anyone. They had known how this was going to go the moment Malcolm had spoken his first words on the stand. The prosecution stood again, smoothing down her blazer. "Your Honor, I would like to recall Officer Calloway to the stand." A ripple of movement. Calloway's lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear, but Calloway didn't fight it. He stood, slow, methodical, walking the long, humiliating path to the witness chair. The prosecutor waited until he was seated. Then she took her time flipping through her notes before finally looking at him. "Officer Calloway, former officer," Malcolm murmured under his breath. Calloway flinched. The prosecutor nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the correction. "Former Officer Calloway," she amended smoothly. "Let's talk about your history with excessive force complaints." Calloway's throat bobbed. The prosecutor cut him off. 17 separate complaints in the past 6 years. Every one of them dismissed." She looked at the jury. "Would you care to tell us why?" Calloway swallowed again. I did my job." The prosecutor stepped forward, tilting her head slightly. "Your job?" Calloway hesitated. "Police work is dangerous. We don't always have time to—" She cut him off again, her voice sharp now. "To follow the law?" Calloway's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. The prosecutor turned back to the jury. "You know what's interesting? None of those complaints ever saw a courtroom. Until now." Calloway shifted in his seat, the weight of his downfall pressing in on all sides. The prosecutor let the moment breathe before her final question. "Do you believe you are above the law, Officer Calloway?" His face twisted slightly. "No." The prosecutor's lips curved. "Just barely." "Good." She turned back toward the judge. No further questions. Calloway slumped back. His career, his reputation, his power gone. And then it was Miller's turn. The prosecution wasn't kind to Miller. They hit him harder than Calloway, because Miller had been the one who pulled the trigger, the one who had killed Rex. The jury watched as the prosecutor played the body cam audio from that night. The cold, sharp crack of the gunshot, the sound of a dog's body hitting the pavement. The recording played the silence that had followed, the moment where Miller could have backed down, where he could have admitted what he had done. But instead, they heard his voice. Dog shouldn't have moved. Malcolm didn't look at Miller, didn't even acknowledge him, because Miller wasn't worth looking at. The prosecutor turned, her voice a quiet dagger. "Do you regret shooting Rex, Officer Miller?" Miller hesitated for too long. Then, finally, he muttered, "It was justified." The jury hated him for it. The prosecutor nodded, slow and deliberate. "No further questions," the judge exhaled, rubbing his temple. "We will resume tomorrow for closing arguments. Court is adjourned." The bailiff banged the gavel, but everyone in that room already knew how this would end. Calloway and Miller were going to prison, and Malcolm was going to watch them disappear. The courtroom was silent, not just quiet, dead silent. The kind of silence that felt like it had weight, pressing down on the room as everyone waited for the inevitable. The defense had collapsed under the sheer force of the evidence, the truth suffocating every last excuse Calloway and Miller had clung to. Now, there was nowhere left to run. The judge shifted slightly, rubbing his brow, clearly exhausted by the circus this trial had become. But Malcolm could see it in his expression. He had already made his decision. Before they got there, though, the attorneys had one last chance to speak. The prosecutor, a woman who had never once fumbled a question, stepped forward first. She didn't bother with notes, didn't need a script. Her argument was already written into the broken bodies, the stolen dignity, the years of unchecked brutality that had been dragged into the light over the past several days. She looked directly at the jury, her voice clear. "There are some cases that are complicated," she said. "Cases where the law is murky, where the truth is tangled, where the line between right and wrong is thin." A pause. "This is not one of those cases." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the gallery, over the journalists, over Calloway and Miller, before finally landing on Malcolm. "You have heard the testimony. You have seen the footage. You have watched, over and over again, as two men who were given power, men who were trusted to protect this city, used that power to destroy lives." Calloway stared at the table. Miller's hands twitched. "This is not about one bad decision," the prosecutor continued. "This is about a pattern of violence, a pattern of abuse, a pattern of corruption that was only stopped because one man refused to be silent." She turned back to the jury, her voice razor-sharp. "You have the power to finish what Malcolm Hayes started." She stepped back. That was it. No theatrics. No unnecessary words. Just the truth. The defense attorney stood, but he already knew he had lost. His argument was rushed, hollow. He tried to frame Calloway and Miller as victims of an overzealous system, tried to cast doubt where none existed, but his words were flimsy, weak, the desperate grasping of a drowning man. When he sat back down, he didn't look at his clients, because he already knew their fate. The judge exhaled. "The jury will deliberate." He banged the gavel. The room stirred as people stretched, murmured, whispered predictions. But there was no real suspense. Everyone already knew what the verdict would be. They didn't take long. Barely an hour later, the jury re-entered the courtroom. The judge asked if they had reached a decision. The foreman stood, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of justice. "Yes, Your Honor." He handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge read it, nodded once, and turned back to the room. In the matter of the state versus Gregory Calloway and Anthony Miller, on the charge of excessive force, he glanced at the jury. How do you find the defendants? Guilty. A ripple moved through the gallery. A quiet, sharp inhale from Calloway. Miller flinched, but said nothing. The judge continued. On the charge of illegal search and seizure, guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. It continued, count after count, charge after charge, guilty, guilty, guilty. By the end, Calloway's face had lost all color. Miller was gripping the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. The judge let the weight of it settle before speaking again. I will now deliver the sentencing. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the bench. Mr. Calloway, Mr. Miller, you abused your positions of power. You violated the public trust. You brutalized the very people you swore to protect. And when confronted with your crimes, you did not show remorse. You showed arrogance. His voice dropped slightly. Quieter now. More dangerous. I have no sympathy for you. Calloway swallowed thickly, his face tight with something between anger and panic. Miller shook his head slightly, as if still refusing to believe this was happening. The judge turned his gaze to the courtroom. The public has watched this case closely. They have seen firsthand what happens when men like these are given unchecked power, and it is my responsibility to ensure they never hold that power again. A pause. Then, finally, for the crimes of excessive force, aggravated assault, and attempted murder, I hereby sentence Gregory Calloway and Anthony Miller to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The room erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, some sat in stunned silence, disbelieving that justice had actually been served. Calloway sank forward, his head in his hands. Miller's mouth fell open slightly, as if he had been expecting some last-minute reprieve that would never come. Malcolm? Malcolm just watched. He felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not joy, not triumph, just finality. They were done. They would never walk free again, never wear a badge again, never hurt another person again, and that was enough. The judge banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. As Malcolm walked out of the courtroom, the cameras were waiting. Journalists rushed forward, shouting questions. Mr. Hayes, do you have a statement? Do you feel like justice was served? Do you have any regrets? Malcolm stopped for just a moment. He thought about Rex, about the night in the street, about the cold silence that had followed, about everything it had taken to get here. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice steady. They got what they deserved. Then, without another word, he walked away. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't look back. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just still, a place where time seemed to slow, where the weight of the past settled into the ground like roots, where voices from yesterday still lingered in the air. Malcolm walked the familiar path, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, the late afternoon breeze cutting across his skin. He had been here before, but this time was different. This time, there was nothing left unfinished. He stopped at the headstone, small, simple, but permanent. Rex, loyal to the end. Malcolm exhaled, crouching down, running his fingers along the cool stone. Hey, boy. The words came out low, rough, almost hesitant. He let the silence stretch before he spoke again, voice steady this time. It's done. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the grass beneath his boots. He tilted his head, as if expecting Rex to be sitting there beside him, tongue out, tail wagging, looking up at him with that same quiet understanding he always had. You were right about them, Malcolm murmured, right from the start. You knew what they were before I did, before I even realized how far they'd go. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. But I made them pay for it, Rex. I didn't just get justice. I took them apart, piece by piece, step by step. You'd have loved it. His lips twitched slightly, but there was no humor in it, Just the cold satisfaction of knowing every single thing that had happened had been because of him. I set it all up perfectly, he continued, voice lower now. Calloway Miller. I didn't just beat them, I made them drown in it. I let them taste real fear for the first time in their miserable lives. I let them think they had a chance, let them tell themselves they could get away with it, let them try to crawl back out. His fingers curled into a fist, pressing lightly against the stone, and then I ripped it away. The words came out harder now, sharper, but not angry, just truthful. I made them feel weak. I made them feel small. I made them feel exactly what they put you through before they put that bullet in you. He leaned back slightly, rolling his shoulders. They never even saw it coming. Not at first. They thought it was just bad luck, thought it was paranoia, thought maybe someone else was setting them up. And when they finally figured it out, a short exhale, almost a laugh. It was too late. His eyes drifted over the headstone again, fingers brushing absent-mindedly across the grass beneath it. You'd have been proud of how I set it up, he murmured. Every detail, every angle, I made sure there wasn't a single way out for them. I let them beat me. I let them think they were winning. And then, when they were comfortable, when they thought it was just going to go away, I destroyed them. His jaw tightened slightly, but not from regret, because he didn't regret it, not a second of it. I made sure they'd never come back from it, Rex. I made sure they wouldn't just lose their jobs. I made sure they lost everything. Their reputations, their power, their freedom. They're gonna rot in a cell for the next 25 years, waking up every morning knowing exactly who put them there. Another long pause. He tilted his head slightly, picturing the way Rex would have sat, ears perked up, watching him with those sharp, trusting eyes. Felt good, he admitted, voice quieter now, putting them down like that. Felt real good. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. But I guess that's not what you'd want to hear, huh? The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of grass and dirt. The evening settling in, the sky stretching into deeper shades of blue. Malcolm sat there for a while, just listening to the silence, to his own breath, to the part of him that had been so damn loud for so long, finally starting to quiet. You'd probably want me to let it go, he muttered. Move on, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can, boy. The words came out softer this time, more honest. He wasn't a fool. He knew this wasn't some storybook ending where everything suddenly felt right again, where the weight disappeared, where the scars healed overnight. But he had done what he set out to do, and maybe, for now, that was enough. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the worn photo he had carried with him all these months. It was faded around the edges, but the image was still clear. Rex, sitting beside him in the backyard, ears up, head tilted slightly, the sun catching in his fur. Malcolm ran his thumb over it, then placed it gently against the stone. I miss you, he said quietly. The wind picked up again, the sky shifting one last time before settling into dusk. He took a breath, deep and steady, then stood. One last look at the headstone, one last moment to let it sink in. Then, finally, he turned and walked away. And this time, he didn't look back. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.